Your Royal Highness, Professor Samsudeen Amali. Sir, it's my honor to meet you again. I recall some years ago when you were the Vice Chancellor of University of Ilorin, I was invited as an external examiner and was also taken to meet you. You're welcome, sir. Chairman, distinguished Professor Na Allah, Vice Chancellor of University of Abuja. Sir, permit me to use the existing protocol to give my keynote address. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, history is made in this 2021 gathering of Nigerian writers in Abuja, not only because this year marks the 40th anniversary of the Association of Nigerian Authors, the largest writers' body in Africa, founded by the legendary novelist and critic, Professor Chinua Achebe, but also because for the first time, the annual convention is taking place at the Maman Batsa Writers Village. I am excited to be the first person to deliver a keynote address on this hallowed ground. For the privilege and honor, I owe many thanks to the Anna Executive Council, ably led by the indefatigable and amiable Mr. Camillus Oka. I thank you all for the invitation to not only give the keynote lecture, but also to be part of this history-making convention at the Maman Batsa Writers Village in Mpape, Abuja. For many years, we were dreaming of a time we would gather here in this place where we could, as writers, discuss matters of interest to our association. This dream has come true. I am glad it is happening in my lifetime. I greet all of you who managed to come to Abuja from far and near in spite of the security situation in the country. Anna will live long. Anna will become stronger and reunite under one umbrella again. Now, the title of my paper is Creativity, Literary Advocacy, and Nation Building, the Role of Nigerian Literature. I'll say that again. Creativity, literary advocacy, and nation building, the role of Nigerian literature. I want to start by introducing the paper. And my introduction is entitled Africa's Encounter with Alien Powers and Forces. For centuries, some Western countries enslaved Africans and colonized and ruled many regions of the world, especially Asia, Africa, the Far East, and the areas known today as North and South America, and the West Indies. Wherever they conquered, dominated, and ruled, these European powers established their own systems of governance and imposed their cultures, including their religion and way of life, on those they dominated. Initially, the idea was to spread the Christian civilization to these, in quote, primitive peoples or pagans, and to create new sources of raw materials for European industries, and also to train people that would ensure the economic growth of the colonizing countries. For a very long time, Black people featured in other people's histories and their cultural productions as subhuman, irrational beings, and people without civilization or history. Africa was regarded as the dark continent. The history of African people's encounter with the Arabs from the Middle East and North Africa, even before the Europeans came, is similar, though slightly different. The Arabs conquered northern parts of Africa and today occupy and possess countries such as Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Sudan. And from these places spread their cultural, religious, and political influence as parts of West, East, Central, or Southern Africa. Islam, like Christianity, became a major religion in Africa, overshadowing, if not replacing outright, the traditional African religions. The Arabs might not have colonized Africa in the real sense of the word, but their influence is felt in many parts of Africa through their religion, Islam, and their language, Arabic, which is spoken in some places and sometimes used as a language of instruction. Wikipedia states that Islam gained momentum during the 10th century in West Africa with the start of the Almoravids movement on the Senegal River. Well, let me take that sentence again. Wikipedia, the online dictionary, states, I quote, Islam gained momentum during the 10th century in West Africa with the start of the Almoravids movement on the Senegal River, and as the rulers embraced Islam. Islam then spread slowly in much of the continent through trade and preaching, and through jihads, I must add, as was the case in northern Nigeria. Uthman Dan Fodio defeated the 7 Hausa states and established the authority of Islam over them. Why do I recount or revisit these histories of violence, conquest, domination, and influence? It is simply because they affected and still affect African writers and what they wrote about in the past and what they write about in the present. In spite of identified flaws in Yambo Ologwen's bound to violence, the upheavals that characterize certain periods of Africa's historical experiences have been graphically explored in the novel. Recently, in 2017, a young Ghanaian American writer, Ya Giasi, published a novel entitled Homegoing, based on the Atlantic slave trade, covering the experiences of more than 3 generations of 2 families from the coast of West Africa, now Ghana, to the plantations in America, and on to modern Ghana and USA. This is a work of epic dimension. The 2 historical novels mentioned above fall into the category critics study under post-colonial writing. In the course of the 20th century, the colonization of the countries of the South by Western countries gave way to political independence for the former colonized countries. But unfortunately, other forms of domination continued. The former colonial masters imposed their cultural values on their former subjects. The phenomenon has become known as cultural domination or cultural imperialism. The rise of the United States of America as a world power has complicated the issue of cultural domination. As a global and economic power, the United States of America overshadows the other Western powers and has inevitably spread its values and permeates and dominates the cultures of other countries in practically every part of the world. In the wake of modernism, postmodernism, its shattering of closures and its reaction against marginalization of cultures and minorities, many such vulnerable groups cashed in on the spirit of the new movement, especially in the 20th century, to empower and encenter themselves in the scheme of things. This dismantling of strong traditional identities and cultures as embodied in the West was inevitable following the decline of modernism and the rise of postmodernism. I have delved into Africa's variegated experiences of Western and Arab domination simply to give a solid background to my discourse. However, this lecture focuses on Nigerian writers, as well as the role Nigerian literature has played in nation building. But first, I would like to define and explain some concepts or key terms that are indispensable to our understanding of the role literature plays in nation building. Culture and identity. I consider it expedient to define some of these key terms: culture and identity. Culture is the sum total of a people's way of life, including their language, food, clothes, traditions, customs, attitudes, beliefs, etc. Quoting answer, Okunna defines culture as that whole complex which includes knowledge, morals, religion, customs and habits, or any other capabilities acquired by man as a member of society, unquote. In their own definition, Kroeber and Clockham state that, I quote, culture consists of patterns, explicit and implicit, of and for behavior acquired and transmitted by symbols, constituting the distinctive achievement of human groups, including their embodiments in artifacts, unquote. Culture, cultural tradition, and oral tradition played major roles in the work of Nigerian writers of the first generation, such as Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Chukwuemeka Ike, and a host of others. The influence of culture is also seen strongly in the writing of those often described as second generation, and they include Femi Oshofiso, Niyi Oshundare, Buchi Emecheta, Festus Iyayi, and a host of others. For these two generations of writers, their cultural identity is not ambiguous, for their works are rooted in the cultures of their people. For instance, the Igbo culture informs Achebe and Emecheta's writing, while Soyinka and Oshofiso are steeped in Yoruba culture. Tanure Ojaide draws material from his Urobo culture in Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta. Oshundare and Chimalon Nwankwo's poetry are rooted in the oral tradition of their people. Zainab Alkali and Abubakar Gimba's fiction are influenced by the cultural traditions of their people, and so on and so forth. A third and perhaps fourth generations of Nigerian writers have since emerged, and their orientation seems to be somewhat different from that of those who preceded them. What is the attitude to culture and to the identity question of the younger generation of writers? To this group belong Nigeria-based writers such as Jude Dibia, Tony Khan, Odile Ujubongo, Abubakar Adam Ibrahim, Hope Raga, Remi Raji, Obari Gumba, and so many others. Now, to this group, that is the third and fourth generation of writers, also belong diaspora-based writers such as Chimamanda Adichie, Helen Habila, Chris Abane, Chika Onigwe, Teju Cole, and so many others. Even those who are winning prizes today, they all belong to this group of writers. Regarding the diaspora writers, most of them had either migrated to the West, Europe and America, from Nigeria, or were born in the West by Nigerian immigrants. Nigerian culture or oral tradition may not charm them as it had charmed the earlier generations. So there seems to be a growing divide between these border-crossing writers and the older writers, as well as writers of their generation who live and write in Nigeria, the indigenous writers, as they are called. In a keynote lecture he gave at the 2018 African Association Conference, ALA, in Washington, D.C., USA, Helen Habila might have spoken for a sizable number of this category of writers, whom he referred to as Afropolitans, borrowing the term propounded by Taye Selassie, who is of Nigerian and Ghanaian parentage. She was born in Africa, but lives in the West now. Habila also referred to these writers as new voices since the Cairn Prize and the Tissalat Prize. And one might add, since the Nigeria Prize for Literature, sponsored by Nigeria LNG, a literary prize that has revolutionized writing in Nigeria. Habila made some remarks regarding African literature and its current state, which were challenged by many of the conference participants, an audience that could easily be described as the cream of modern African and African diaspora literary critics. One of the questions Habila raised was, I quote him, "What is the future of African literature?" He touched briefly on the language question in African literature and wondered if the African writer was, I quote him, still in a state of delusion. What does the term nation mean to the writer, unquote? Pointing out that a writer like Dambuzo Marachere of, the late Dambuzo Marachere of Zimbabwe, had rejected being classified as an African writer, Habila seems to think that the term African literature may have lost its meaning, especially for the writers who like him, either migrated or were born outside Africa. In the criticism of the works of African migrant writers, new terms like global writing and post-nation are used to discuss works like Teju Cole's Open City and Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, terms that exclude the writing of Africa-based or African indigenous writers. The diaspora-based writers have often been criticized for pandering to Western tastes. Habila endorses Selassie's categorization of diaspora writers as Afropolitans and considers it a more viable definition. He advocates a resistance to what he calls the confines of boundaries. I'm quoting him. The truth is that the writers who regard themselves as Afropolitans do not want to carry the burden of African issues or concerns. This is probably because foreign publishers who publish their works are not interested in the concerns of Africa. They are compelled to write what the West wants to read. On the other hand, indigenous writers prefer to recreate experience from the African perspective about the nation, especially regarding issues of corruption, bad leadership, and bad governance, ecological problems, insecurity, and gender issues. Habila is of the view that writers can write on any subject, as Chimamanda Adichie and Teju Cole, Chika Onigwe, and etc. have done. He disapproves African literature's insistence on materiality and the humanity of the people, but rather prefers that the focus of writing should be the individual in the world. According to him, a writer is free to use his or her work to intervene, protest, and he or she can be political, using the writing to instruct and entertain. He called this instrumental aesthetics. In his own keynote address at the same conference in Washington, the critic Atokwesin cautions against the over-lionization of Taye Selassie's Afropolitanism, which he describes as a variant of cosmopolitanism, and which he thinks is, I quote him, completely rubbish. The question that came to my mind, which I asked Habila, was what he thought would be the fate of African literature as a discipline and as a critical category if we abrogate or abandon the term. What would be the fate of our hallowed and famous association, African Literature Association? Would we then split the discipline into two, African literature, one, and two, diaspora African literature, and subsequently split the association into two as African Literature Association and Diaspora African Literature Association? Do the transcultural experiences of the migrant writers exclude their works from being classified as African literature or Nigerian literature for the purpose of our engagement in this lecture? These are questions for Habila and those who share his views, and also for all of us who are Nigerian and African writers and critics. I should point out, though, that there are migrant writers based in the West, like Tanure Ojaide and Chimalon Nwankwo, and outside Nigeria, a writer like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who are somewhat suspicious of globalization and prefer to project their culture in the global scene. The above reflections on culture, tradition, migration, and African writers across generations dovetail nicely with the issue of identity. Culture is considered to be central to the construction of identity theories. I'm interested in the theory known as identity negotiation theory, which was first described by Stella Ting Tumi in 1986. The act of negotiation takes place at the point when individuals in an intercultural or transcultural situation embark on defining, modifying, asserting their own self-image or identity. Nigerian migrant writers battle with this form of negotiation, no doubt. Thus, the individuals, while protecting their own identity or culture, are aware of other individuals' rights to theirs. Consequently, the individual promotes oneness with others while respecting diversity. The whole idea is that the individual undergoes cultural experiences in relationships with others rather than being trapped in his or her monoculture. This is exactly the experience of Ifemelo in Adichie's most recent novel, Americana. Much of the novel recounts Ifemelo's individual experiences among cultures, ethnicities, gender situations, and racial divides. This is an illustration of identity negotiation in a transcultural setting. Transculturalism involves a merging of two cultures, with each reflecting the other, as if seeing oneself in the other. It involves merging, mingling, or combining the features or elements of more than one culture. Fernando Ortiz, a South American scholar, defines transculturalism as, I quote him, a synthesis of two phases occurring simultaneously, leading to the construction of something different, a new common culture. This type of identity, embracing a new common culture, is what is needed in Nigeria today to unite all the ethnic nationalities for the purpose of building a strong nation under the mantra, unity in diversity. Literature can help us achieve this important goal. In the next section of my lecture, I will discuss the role of Nigerian literature in nation building by examining the experience of Nigeria's indigenous writers as well as the transcultural experience of Nigeria's diaspora writers, with close reference to the contributions their works have made to the cultural, political, socio-economic, and physical developments of Nigeria. Now I want to look at literature as a tool for nation building. For me, nation building and national development are semantically the same and will be used interchangeably in this lecture. As I stated in an earlier lecture, development is the gradual growth of a people and a country so that they become better, more advanced, leading to an unfolding of the potentialities of the individuals in that society. Development can be two ways. On one hand, the physical factor in the form of infrastructure, and on the other hand, the human factor, which is indispensable because it is when people are properly educated and socialized that any form of development can take place. Without education, there can be no development. Development, therefore, is people-driven. Consequently, for a country to develop, the citizens must be equipped with a sound, well-grounded and balanced humanities and science education, right from primary to the secondary and tertiary levels. The point I'm making is that literature among the humanities is the most efficacious subject or discipline to provide the humanistic education Nigeria needs to make progress and to escape from the scourge of corruption, ethnicity, nepotism, greed, and bad leadership. Literature teaches us about life, enriches our experience of human psychology and relationships, which are needed to build character and nurture balanced human beings. Romanus Egudu rightly states that the literary artist, and I'm quoting him now, dissects the society not only at its political, but also at its moral level. Nigerian writers have always pursued these goals since Nigerian literature came of age with the publication of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart in 1958. Nigerian writers are among the best, not only in Africa, but also in the world. They are contributing through the power of their imagination and artistic creativity to the growth of literary productions that are changing the face of Nigerian as well as world literature. Many of our writers have put Nigerian literature in the world's Literary Hall of Fame and contributed to Nigeria's cultural and intellectual development. They have used art as a means of effecting revolutionary change in society. For instance, in Season of Anomy, Soyinka creates characters like Ofeyi and Demakin, who act as agents of justice with the moral and humane spirit lost by the society through the evil machination of two oppressive regimes. Through them and the forces they represent, Soyinka hopes to restore to his society its moral character and humane sensibility. From a close reading of some texts available to us, it is quite obvious that literature can be a catalyst to revolutionary change. What is required is for the individual or reader, or individuals and readers, to apply the knowledge, the information gathered from literature to bring about social change. The unrelenting persecution faced by writers all over the world is a clear indication that literature can indeed be a weapon to achieve change and raise the consciousness of a people, which bad leaders dread. Dictatorial and bad leaders always hate writers because they fear them, you see. Examples abound. In South Africa, during the apartheid era, we saw such leaders. In Kenya, during the time of Arap Moi. In Nigeria, during the period of military dictatorship, especially under Abacha. In Eastern European countries, during the Cold War, and in some Islamic states in the Arab world. In these places and others, many writers face and still face death sentence, imprisonment, and detention as a result of their work and their activism. Nigeria was 21 years old in 1981 when the legendary Chinua Achebe gathered other writers together at Nsukka to form the Association of Nigerian Authors. This calls to memory a similar gathering of writers at the All-Soviet Congress of Writers in 1934, where A.A. Zanov declared that, I quote him, "The writer must depict life not simply as objective reality, but in its revolutionary development," unquote. Similarly, most Nigerian writers have always depicted life with objective reality, interpreted history, and portrayed the sociocultural developments and political challenges in the country. This is not unique to Nigeria, for as I stated elsewhere, I quote, "Examples abound in literature from all over the world of how writers use the power of the imagination and the illusion of reality to create and recreate experiences that hold up a mirror to their societies." to view their actions and understand the need to achieve positive transformation in the society. The renowned Achebe explored the impact of colonization and the British colonial administration in Igbo land in Things Fall Apart. The literary history of Nigeria has been driven by resilience, courage, commitment, and the will or determination of the writers to guide, lead, and direct the developing and evolving nation along the path of unity, accountability, positive social change, and reorientation. For a literature that is conscious of the need to empower and encourage the people with self-knowledge, as well as teach them their past, present, and even future for the purpose of societal re-engineering, the importance of creating or nurturing an inclusive literary culture that harnesses and promotes writing from every part of the country is imperative. As we all know, literature in its oral and written forms has always been a tool to entertain and instruct the individual, the family, the community, and the society at large. For example, in the traditional society, folk tales, fables, myths, riddles, legends, forms of oral literature were used to give pleasure as well as teach both the young and the not so young in the family or community. Literature in its oral form has continued to fulfill this function in modern society. In other words, literature has always been deployed to the service of society. History has been described as the hero of Nigerian literature because the development and growth of the literature appears to have been anchored on the historical moments that characterized and still characterize the thematic preoccupations of what we know today as Nigerian literature. The literary production emanating from Nigeria, the literary productions emanating from Nigeria have consistently focused on the cultures and way of life of the people in various parts of the country. Apart from the writers, and apart from writers such as Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Flora Nwapa, Cyprian Ekwensi, Mabel Shegu, Femi Oshofiso, and many others, the younger generation of writers such as Ben Okri, Chimamanda Adichie, Nabila Sefiata, and others, who had migrated to the West, began to produce literature that consciously mingled or merged issues and experiences from Nigeria with those from their new places of domicile. This transcultural literary experience from Nigeria with those from their new places of domicile. This transcultural literary experience is a result of the crossing of physical and cultural boundaries and the encouragement or advocacy of the intermingling of different peoples, communities, ethnic groups, and cultures. This global and transcultural movement, when examined, shows the variety of ways Nigerian writers in the diaspora have used their writings to educate, enlighten, caution, and inspire their readers, thereby creating a literature that is dynamic, functional, and relevant to national development. It is proper at this point to mention specifically the contribution women writers have made in engendering equity and parity in gender relations and in creating awareness of the plight of women in Nigeria's patriarchal society. with the aim to change the status quo, many Nigerian women writers have consistently portrayed the injustice the female gender faces from birth to old age in Nigeria. There is no doubt that Nigeria can boast of having some of the finest women prose writers, especially novelists in the world. More and more women writers are springing up, writing in the various genres: prose, poetry, drama, and children's literature. Nigerian women writers, there are many. I can only just mention a few here. They include writers, both those who are dead and those who are alive today: Flora Nwapa, Buchieme Cheta, Zainab Alkali, Ifeoma Okoye, Mabel Shegu, Akachi Adimorah Ezeigbo, Karen Kingari Bisala, Ifeoma Nwoye, Maria Ajima, Chimamanda Adichie, Sefiata, Chika Onigwe, Kaine Agari, Unoma Azua, Lola Shoneyi, Helen Oyeyemi, Vicky Sylvester, Chibundu Onuzo, Adobe Trisha Nwaubani. There are so many, I can't mention all of them. Like Tess Onweme, there are so many of them. And Toki Mwabugunje, there are so many, I can't mention all of them. Jumoke Verisimo, there are many. So, but what the point I'm making is that women writers are on the rise. I remember at a gathering, Wole Soyinka, I think it was a gathering brought together by Glow Communication. Wole Soyinka said, the women are coming, and they are indeed coming. Or they have come even. These women writers raise women's consciousness, address the woman question in gender politics, thus drawing attention to the fact that women are subjugated and marginalized. It is obvious that culture is pivotal in the subordination of women to a subaltern position in discourse and in real life. Nigerian women writers empower women in their writing and give them agency. Feminism is a powerful ideology they deploy to liberate women in their works and include them as participants with men in nation building. Sometimes it takes just an individual to initiate an action that triggers a chain reaction which can change the rules for thinking and influence the balance of power in a conservative society or community like Nigeria. This is exactly what happens in Tess Onweme's remarkable play, The Reign of Wazobia. When Wazobia, a young woman from anonymity, becomes the regent of Anioma Kingdom, mobilizing women and some gender-sensitive men to bring about a revolution that banishes the obnoxious cultural traditions that infringe on women's rights in the society. Somebody said that women's rights are human rights. A question often asked is, how are women writers using their creativity to better the lot of women? Those of you who are women writers here, think of that question. In Onweme's play, The Reign of Wazobia, the character Wazobia is a symbol of women's leadership potentials that must be nurtured through the support of women and men. Let us give women a chance in this country. Why can't we elect a woman president and see if women can make a change? We have long been mired by all kinds of problems in Nigeria. Don't you think it's time to give women a chance? Maybe they can prove better than the men have proved. The role of literature in the indigenous languages in nation building must not be overlooked in this lecture. for it is as important as Nigerian literature produced in the English language. Strands of our cultures are lost when we write in a foreign language. Our cultures are encoded in the languages we speak. When I reflect on the beauty of my Igbo language embedded in the songs, proverbs, riddles, and books I enjoyed while growing up, I feel deeply sad that this experience is probably denied my grandchildren, often because I, and perhaps you, in a similar situation, have not cared enough to ensure that these children have this experience. Do they speak your language? The youth hardly speak their mother tongues anymore. Yes, some people in Nigeria are agitating that French and Chinese languages should be made Nigeria's second and third languages, whereas their children, they themselves do not even speak their mother tongue. How many people in this room write in the numerous languages? Over 250, we are told, that Nigeria boasts of. How many of you can write in your mother tongue? But we know that language is a carrier of the culture of the people that speak it. And to conquer a people physically, mentally, and psychologically, all you need to do is to impose your language on them and force them to learn to speak it. Then they will forget their own. If properly harnessed, the literature in indigenous languages can be used for national development, especially in the areas where the languages are spoken. I often advocate that different locations in Nigeria should make the language of that area compulsory to everybody living there. If you want to migrate to another cultural area, you learn their language, okay? In this section of the paper, I have tried to highlight the role of literature in nation building. The best Nigerian writers have recreated the country in fiction, drama, and poetry. A number of authors of children's literature are coming up, and they are producing good books to educate and entertain our children. The Nigeria LNG, in its wisdom, included children's literature among the genres to be awarded the Nigeria Prize for Literature, which is worth $100,000. This reward is already galvanizing writers to strive to write excellent books for young readers. Literature for children is a big business in the West, where scholars engage in research on books written for children. There, children are socialized to read books, especially in the library. I advise policymakers in education in Nigeria to make literature compulsory in primary and secondary schools in Nigeria. I share Funke Lawal's vision of a virile education in literature, and I quote her: "To raise children who can make responsible choices, writing, acting, singing, instead of cultic activities, prostitution and robbery. Students who can apply critical thinking skills, inquiry, problem solving, and interpretation of issues, confronting them instead of passive observation, copying, and aping. I unquote. It requires making literature a meaningful creative activity, encouraging interactions and transactions among learners with books they read, tapping the power of reflection to develop students' imagination, and helping them to attain emotional and imaginative perceptions of the issues raised in their literature books. I agree with Professor Okenimpe, that reading the works of great writers enables us, I quote him, to sense the efficacy of literature for opening our eyes to the realities behind experience and perceptions which we had taken for granted, and for stirring us to reorder our orientations. Literature can do this for us. An important aspect of the role of literature in national development is the fact that literature enriches our lives and enlarges our experience of life by giving us aesthetic pleasure and spiritual inspiration. The trauma of insecurity in Nigeria today is a subject that should engage our writers. They need to write about it with the aim of exposing those responsible and shaming them, with the hope that they will change their evil ways, whether they are Boko Haram terrorists, whether they are kidnappers or bandits, armed robbers, unknown gunmen, rapists, cultists, or ritual killers. Writers should bomb them with words, and expose their villainy to the public so that they are brought to book and their evil deeds stopped. Ada Aharonai, an Israeli professor and writer, her counsel to those who wield the pen. All of us here, we wield the pen, don't we? Her advice to us as writers is to, I quote her, she says, "How come the cultural world is silent? Where are the intellectuals, the journalists, NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that should bomb terrorism with their words and their pens and throw them out of our lives and of our planets forever? Bombing the terrorists with planes from the skies is not enough. We have to go to the source of their sinning souls and bomb them. Let's touch their humanity. Condemn them and shame them with all the power of our pens, our computers, our smartphones, and our creative works." Unquote. Nigerian writers should raise their voices against the unprecedented and unspeakable challenges facing the country at the moment. They should fight with words and not swords. Yes, we should fight with words. They say the pen is mightier than the gun. Let us fight with words. That is what we have. Now, conclusion and recommendation. In the course of this lecture, I have explored the value of literature to society and to national development. I reiterate that there can be no end to the ways in which literature can contribute to national development, apart from its other role of entertaining people and giving them aesthetic pleasure. We have just entered the third decade of the 21st century. The future is beckoning to intelligent and rational individuals, groups, and nations to come up with innovative ways of creating comfort and peace for people and nations of the world. Nigeria must not be left out in the race for progress. Only disciplined, creative, and imaginative people can drive progress, especially technological progress. I believe that literature can help our people to acquire the necessary discipline and creative impetus. Consequently, even as emphasis is laid on science, engineering, and technology, literature must be carried along in order to ensure that our country is properly humanized, socialized, and integrated into the finest ideals of our cultures. The literature by migrant or diaspora writers who call themselves global writers, and that by Nigeria-based writers, also known as indigenous writers, work together to the glory of the country. The literature produced at home and in the diaspora should make Nigeria proud. Obviously, our governments, federal and state, do not pay enough attention to the arts and culture, and consequently, these areas do not attract adequate funding. What then is to be done? One way to go about it is to encourage the nurturing of a literary society in order to develop outstanding reading culture. Creative writing should be promoted at all levels of the education system, primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. The importance of the formation of book clubs in schools cannot be overemphasized. Our people must become book lovers. Yes, we must all become book lovers. Whether you are reading digital books, e-books, or physical books, it does not matter. Whichever you lay your hands on, be a book lover. Our people must become avid readers, both physical and e-books, whichever is available. Literature in indigenous languages should be promoted by governments. The promotion of writing in both English and indigenous languages calls for gender balance and inclusion of other genres like children's literature. Children's literature deserves more attention than it is getting at the moment in Nigeria. Unlike in the United Kingdom and United States of America, where children's literature enjoys a pride of place. Federal and state governments must get involved and establish language and cultural centers to coordinate linguistic development, train teachers to teach local languages, and give scholarship to students studying indigenous languages. This strategy would reinforce the efforts of UNESCO to ensure the survival of all languages, especially in Nigeria. The National Institute of Nigerian Languages, NINLAN, located in Aba, should be given a facelift and adequate funding to carry out its responsibilities. If you go there now, you see how run down that place is. At the moment, it is neglected and starved of funds by the federal government. Literature must stand up to be counted as a partner in progress with science and technology to build a strong, united, and economically viable nation. This is already happening, for some of our great literary works have been filmed and recorded electronically and produced in other forms for the present and for the future. I think Dr. Wale Okediro's Tenants of the House is a very good example. It's a film that all of us must watch. Thank you. When people read, they become educated. When they become educated, they gain knowledge. Knowledge is power. It is only knowledge and the application of knowledge to bring about change that can save our people and cause a redistribution of wealth so that every Nigerian will be in a position to take care of himself or herself. I dare say that literature is one of the sources of this knowledge. Thank you very much for listening.